Last year's failed Copenhagen climate summit put the divide between rich and poor countries on full display. The U.S. and China were criticized for refusing to accept major emissions cuts, while the U.S. and other Western nations led opposition to the principle of climate reparations, compensating poorer countries for the devastation of global warming. But another divide appears to have worsened in Copenhagen, and that's a divide within the environmental movement itself. Major environmental groups are coming under criticism from within their own ranks for taking positions that some say are antithetical to their stated missions of saving the planet. In the latest issue of The Nation magazine, the British journalist Johann Hari writes, "As we confront the biggest ecological crisis in human history, many of the green organizations meant to be leading the fight are busy shoveling up hard cash from the world's worst polluters and burying science-based environmentalism in return, in the middle of a swirl of bogus climate scandals trumped up by deniers. Here is the real Climategate," he says. Well, Johann Hari joins me here now from London, England. He's a columnist for the London Independent. His article for The Nation is called "The Wrong Kind of Green." We're also joined from Washington, D.C. by journalist Christine McDonald. She used to work for one of the groups discussed at length in Johann Hari's article. She worked for Conservation International, or CI, but she's since written a book criticizing CI, as well as in other environmental groups, for taking stances she suggests have been heavily influenced by corporate donors and partners. The book is called Green Ink. An environmental insider reveals how a good cause has gone bad. Several major environmental groups are criticized in both Johann Hari's article and Christine McDonald's book, the foremost being Conservation International. We contacted CI about appearing on a broadcast, but they declined our request. Johann Hari, let's start with you in London. What do you mean by the wrong kind of green?
Well, I was pretty shocked in Copenhagen. For the past few years, I've been reporting from all over the world about the effects of global warming in places like Bangladesh, where already people are dying, Darfur, where the genocide began when the water dried up and people began killing themselves for what remained, or the Arctic, where since the year I was born, 1979, 40% of the summer sea ice is gone, and in my lifetime we will live to see a point on the current rate when the North Pole is a point in the open ocean that can be reached by boat. And I always imagined when I was doing that reporting that these big groups like Conservation International or the Nature Conservancy had my back in Washington and had the back of all the people I was seeing who were dying as a result of this. So it was really strange to go to Copenhagen and see how these groups, in fact, often behind closed doors, but when the European green groups saw what they were doing and the American green groups who don't take money from polluters saw what they were doing, came to me and said, these groups are campaigning for a system that will cause the rainforest to die sooner than global warming requires, or global warming would cause, and they were dismissing the real solutions to global warming as unworkable or politically unrealistic. And so I began on this journey of thinking, why would this happen? Why would these groups, who are funded to some degree by ordinary good Americans concerned with this great crisis, why would they be behaving this way? And the only explanation that anyone can come up with is that they take money from the worst polluters in the world. They are dependent on the worst polluters in the world. Now, if you try to imagine this in any other sphere, you realise how odd it is. Imagine if Amnesty International was dependent just to write human rights reports on funding from Dick Cheney, the Burmese junta and Robert Mugabe. Imagine if the NAACP ran because every time Rush Limbaugh made a racist comment, he gave them some money as a little bit of reputational insurance. We would all see that that was a corrupt model of working. That is how the big conservation groups have begun to work since the 1980s, as Christine shows in her excellent book, and it's become normal. And that process has really corrupted those groups from the inside. It means that when it comes to really big issues, they are advocating things that are, at best, way short of what the science says we need, and at worst, actually covering up for some of the worst polluters.
Johann Hari, you write in your piece in The Nation magazine, you give a history. You start by talking about the president of the National Wildlife Federation in the early 1980s, Jay Hare.
Yeah, he was the person who initiated this idea of taking money from groups like Shell and BP. Now, you've got to understand, these were groups that were committing environmental atrocities across the world. They were, it is not an exaggeration to say they were the single worst polluters. Now, these groups are very clear about why they give money. When they speak in their unguarded moments, for example, Michael G. Morris, the head of American Electrical Power, an appalling group, one of the worst polluters in America, told the Washington Post, you know, when Greenpeace say we give money because we want to carry on burning coal, because we want to carry on polluting, you betcha. They're very clear about it. The only people who aren't clear about it are the groups taking the money.
Well, Christy McDonald, you have written the book Green Ink, an environmental insider reveals how a good cause has gone bad. Now, this is not just you doing research about an issue you got interested in, but it's about your own, it begins with your own experience at Conservation International, at CI. Can you explain what the group is? And by the way, we did invite them on the broadcast. And, well, how you came to, well, become a kind of whistleblower within this environmental group.
Well, in 2006, I was offered a job working with Conservation International's international communications program doing media training in the developing world. Conservation International is based in Washington, but it operates only in mostly developing countries and 40 countries around the world where there's a lot of biodiversity. And I'd been very interested, as a general assignment reporter, I'd been gravitating toward environmental stories for many years, and I'd lived in Latin America and seen a lot of environmental problems firsthand in the developing world. So I thought this was a dream job. I was very excited about taking this job. And I knew that Conservation International worked with corporations before I started working there. And I thought, just like many members of the public, that this was a wonderful idea that environmentalists could help influence corporations to do the right thing and to improve their track record. But quickly, I mean, within weeks, within days of arriving there, I realized that it seems that the corporations have had more of an influence on these nonprofit groups than they have had on the corporations. For instance, the public, you know, if you look at opinion polls, people have a high degree of respect for environmental groups and really think of these groups as grassroots organizations that are representing the public. But many of these organizations operate more like corporations today than they do nonprofit grassroots organizations. Their presidents, their leaders are called president and CEO, and they make tremendously good salaries that put them in the top 1% of U.S. taxpayers. The average salary for a CEO in many of these organizations is between $400,000 and $500,000 a year. And then there are people like Steve Sanderson, who runs the Wildlife Conservation Society, which runs the Bronx Zoo and a whole lot of international conservation programs. He also has a $225,000 a year expense account. And they spend most of their time, you know, when I worked at CI, the CEO, Peter Seligman, and Russ Mittermeier, the president, were hardly ever in the building. They would show up for every 3 months for the planning meetings that would take place. But the rest of the time, they spent much of the rest of their time traveling around the world, often in the company of CEOs or retired moguls and Hollywood stars. They often traveled on private jets that the corporations provided for them. They often rented yachts and Land Rovers, which are gas-guzzling vehicles, in order to wine and dine and show some of the most beautiful and pristine places in the world to their corporate donors, in order to fundraise, which is a good thing. And it's not that they aren't doing some good work with the money they received, but when you step back and look at all of the polluting companies, the most polluting companies in the world give money to these organizations, and at the end of the day, the corporations have gotten a much better deal. And how do you see it affecting their work? How do you see it compromising their environmental work? In many ways, these environmental groups run satellite PR offices for these corporations. So oftentimes the corporations cozy up to environmental groups because either there's been some kind of accident or tragedy and they need to repair their reputation, or they're going for a big contract, or they want to build a project. For instance, in Bolivia several years ago, there was BP was looking to build a pipeline that would go straight through virgin virgin rainforest. And of course, there was a lot of opposition on the ground and from other environmental groups. A lot of large environmental groups, such as World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy, first came out against this plan to build the pipeline. But then BP came up with a plan to provide several $1 million in funding for conservation projects. And World Wildlife Fund and several of the other groups changed their position and backed the BP pipeline in order to obtain these funds.
We're talking to Christine
That's
McDonald,
just one of many examples.
Who is author of Green Ink, an environmental insider, reveals how a good cause has gone bad. And Johann Hari, he is a reporter with the London Independent, has written this very interesting piece, The Wrong